Welcome to Climate Action, how innovation can have an impact on home, travel and food. I'm Ian Mabbott, I'm an Associate Professor from Swansea University and I'll be chairing this session. This event is hosted by the Centre for Climate Change Innovation. So that's an initiative of the Grantham Institute at Imperial College London and the Royal Institution with an aim to catalyse innovation of all forms that address the causes and effects of climate change. The event's been organised as part of the UK University's Climate Innovation Showcase, which is part of the COP26 Universities Network. I'd just like to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Just to let you all know, the event is being recorded and will be shared after the event. All cameras have been automatically switched off and the microphones have been automatically muted. During the panel discussion, please send questions via the chat function. Really looking forward to getting your questions. And please also tag us on social media. You can use @CCC Innovation and @COP Universities with a hashtag of COP26 Universities. Okay, so I'm here at our active office in Swansea. So this is a building developed by Specific Innovation Knowledge Centre and has led to the formation of the Active Building Centre, trying to roll these things out at a large scale. Okay, all of these sorts of projects are consortia of many university, industry and community partners, and we have a drive to create more desirable futures through innovation. Okay, the buildings are designed to generate more clean energy than they consume. So here on our campus, we can trade energy with our neighboring buildings, and we can also use them to charge electric vehicles. You can see one just behind me. So that's probably a more important use for us in our environment, is to switch from diesel to switch our fleet from diesel to electric vehicles charged via solar energy. And we have a related project, Sunrise, which addresses different challenges in the global south. So rural communities there might have different needs for excess energy, things like boosting agricultural productivity being a real key. So I think the key here is that innovations in power, buildings, transport, and even the decarbonisation of the industries that make the materials to produce electric cars and buildings with integrated renewables, these things don't happen in isolation. So I guess the big question then is, what is innovation? And really, ultimately, it's just turning ideas into useful actions. And this can happen at all scales. There's a few schools of thought around how much innovation we've got left to do in order to tackle some of the issues around climate change. And I guess at two ends of the spectrum, we have some people who think that we've got all of the technologies we need, we just need to deploy them. And then there are others who think that perhaps half of the innovations required to meet the climate challenges haven't even been invented yet. So we've got an awful lot of work to do in a very short space of time. And I think a kind of a third angle on some of that is that there are schools of thought that that really feel that the sort of scale of the changes required are so drastic that we start to lose sight of what it means to be human. Now, I think that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of all of this. So demonstrations of technologies like those behind me help us to deploy some of those innovations that exist. But as we do so, we're going to find new areas where we need to innovate and update. But there's a place for innovation in making things more efficient as well. So to take the pressure off these systems, we can drive efficiencies by reducing waste. So reducing waste materials and resources that we use, the food we eat, the power we consume, and the journeys that we make. So when we think about climate change, most people tend to reflect on what they can do as individuals to have an impact, and that's going to be our focus today. There's a wide range of climate innovations that play an important role in enabling individuals to make meaningful and impactful climate action. They're not necessarily known to the wider public. So making our homes more energy efficient, addressing food waste and choosing greener travel options are some of the example areas that can touch upon our daily lives, where we need to address innovation as part of our transition to net zero. So these areas all need to be decarbonised, and we all have a part to play in the process. So on that note, I'm really delighted to welcome a panel of experts today, and who will give a little introduction to themselves and their work. And towards the end, we will field some questions from you in the audience to get the experts' opinions. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Mark Stetler, who's a senior lecturer from Imperial College London, and he has a lot of expertise around transportation. We've also got Dr. Anna Mavrogianni, who's an associate professor from University College London, who focuses on homes. And we've got Professor Angela Karp, who's the director and chief executive of Rothamsted Research, who can give us some insight into the agricultural aspects. So as I say, we will hear from our panelists, and then we'll take your questions at the end. So on that note, I'll hand over to Mark to kick us off by talking about transport.
Thanks very much, Ian. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of introduce this very simple identity equation, which helps us to understand the kind of drivers for carbon emissions from our transport activity. And using this identity equation, we can see that it really comes down to 4 factors that drive carbon emissions from the transport sector. And those factors are the mobility, which is the amount that we travel by different modes of transport. The occupancy factor, which kind of gives us an indication of how many vehicle kilometers are needed to fulfill 1 passenger kilometer. So you can compare an example of driving in a car on your own, or taking a busy metro or underground train. And clearly, while the underground train might consume more energy itself, it has, because it's carrying more people, that energy is spread out over more people. The third factor is the energy intensity, which gives us an idea of how efficient a mode of transport is. So, this is the amount of energy that is consumed by that vehicle per kilometer that it travels. And then the fourth factor is this carbon intensity, which is how much CO2 is produced per kilowatt hour of energy that's consumed by that vehicle. And that varies significantly with different fuels. So comparing, say, fossil fuels versus biofuels, or what are called sustainable liquid fuels, versus hydrogen versus electricity. So those 4 factors are really important, and they do vary significantly for different modes of transport. If we do this calculation globally over all travel, then what we see is that road transport by far and away is the most dominant source of carbon dioxide emissions from the transport sector. There are significant contributions from other modes of transport, and shipping and aviation are important. And what we also mustn't forget here is that we have the transport associated with moving people, but as important, and in fact, what's growing more quickly, is the transport associated with moving goods around the world. So there are huge benefits associated with transport, and transport systems enable our societies to trade goods, to trade ideas, to visit, to access more things, so that there are benefits associated with transport. On an individual level, you can use this sort of framework to understand where your own impact is coming from. And an individual's impact, or an individual's carbon emissions, will vary hugely depending on how much they travel and by what mode. So people who travel a lot and take multiple flights will have a carbon footprint that's several orders of magnitude perhaps more than someone who just travels by active travel mode, so walking and cycling. And that's important when we realize what the sort of scale and differences are between the sort of developed countries and developing countries. So as an individual, if you're thinking about ways in which you could reduce your carbon footprint associated with transport, you can use these sort of 4 factors to think about levers in which you could move to reduce your footprint. So one is that you could just stop moving completely, right? And that would send your footprint to 0. But the problem with that is that you wouldn't see anybody, and you wouldn't be able to go and get your shopping. So that might not be desirable. That's kind of facetious, but you can think about the mode that you choose to travel, right? And that's probably the most important decision that you could make as an individual in terms of your transport carbon footprint. If you choose to travel by these sort of active travel modes, what you're doing is you're reducing the energy intensity of that mode of travel. You're also reducing the carbon intensity. But because it's a slower mode of travel, what you probably find is that you would travel less in that instance. And so you'd also be reducing your mobility. I want to mention the sort of electric vehicle example, as Ian mentioned that just now. So efficiency is important when we're considering electric vehicles too. So do we really need electric vehicles which have huge batteries that give us hundreds of miles of range, when we actually really don't need that much range for the vast majority of our journeys? And that vehicle would be less efficient in operation, but significantly for electric vehicles, it would also cost more to manufacture, both in terms of energy and CO2 emissions. So that's important. We shouldn't neglect energy efficiency when we think about electric vehicles. And actually, there will be constrained sources of renewable low carbon electricity, which means that lots of different sectors are going to be fighting over a limited resource. And so we should be trying to increase and maximize the efficiency of even of electric vehicles. So if I could have the next slide, please. I want to kind of just touch on aviation because this is related to some of the research that we're doing at the moment. And what I've done here is I've just changed around this equation a little bit, and I've now called it aviation's climate impact on the left-hand side, and it's dependent on the same factors in terms of the amount that we travel, the energy intensity, and the carbon intensity. And for aviation, the big thing that the sector is sort of hoping for is a huge increase in low carbon intensity fuels. So that what the aviation industry is calling sustainable aviation fuels. They might be derived from biofuels, so from plants, and there's an overlap there, and important considerations about how that interacts with food chains, food supply, and land use. But they're also thinking about electrofuels, which are derived by splitting water to turn it into hydrogen, and combining that with carbon dioxide that's extracted from the atmosphere to turn then into a hydrocarbon fuel that can be used as a drop-in replacement for jet fuel today. So the scale up of these technologies, while they exist today, they are producing really tiny scale amounts of fuels that could replace jet fuel, fossil jet fuel. So the scale up is really significant for aviation to achieve net zero by anything like mid-century. And while the technology does exist, there are significant risks around that. The final factor that I've added on the right-hand side of this equation is the fact that aviation has significant non-CO2 climate impacts. And this is an area of work we're involved in, looking at these contrails that are produced by aviation. And these don't necessarily scale with the distance that you travel in the same way that carbon dioxide emissions do. So that's something that we're looking at, and whether we can reduce the non-CO2 impacts, which have an effect on climate change that is similar in magnitude to CO2. And so we're looking at minimizing that part of this equation, the non-CO2 impacts associated with contrails, without increasing the amount of flight distance that's traveled, and therefore reducing aviation's overall climate impact. So those are, relatively simple equations and simple concepts, but I hope they give you some idea into how you could individually address your own carbon footprint. But I'd also be very happy to take any further questions on some of the detail that I've skipped over.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. That's a really interesting insight into those aspects around transport. And next up, we're going to move to Anna, who can give us a view of our efficiency in our homes. Over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Mark, very much for this very interesting presentation. I'm afraid I don't have such a clear equation for housing. And also I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this very timely discussion around innovation during COP26. So I was just to talk about innovation in space heating homes, but I'd like to talk about year-round performance more broadly, because I'm a firm believer that we need to adopt a holistic approach when it comes to energy efficiency in homes. So what are the challenges currently for UK housing? We're at a very important juncture for homes in the UK. As we know, the government has set a very ambitious climate target to achieve net zero by 2050, and around 1/5 of UK's greenhouse gas emissions are attributed to energy use in homes. So housing is a very important component in our transition towards net zero, and our emissions are currently off track, and this has been exacerbated during the COVID-19 pandemic, with many of us who are lucky enough to work from home. Existing housing in the UK has some of the worst thermal efficiency levels in Europe. And we really need to focus on existing homes, because the annual turnover rate of the stock is very low, around 1 to 2% renewal rates annually. So it's really the existing stock, those buildings that will stand for years to come, that we really need to focus on. So we need to decarbonize those 29 million thermally inefficient and insulated leaky homes. It's a very big, unprecedented engineering challenge. It's been estimated around 2 homes needed retrofitted per minute or similar. And there is a lot of research and monitoring data and field studies that have identified the most efficient strategies and measures that should be implemented. In broad terms, these are by reducing building fabric heat loss by increasing insulation, reducing unintended air exchange by increasing air tightness, and installing more efficient heating systems such as heat pumps, for example. And although energy retrofit will have clear benefits for winter thermal comfort and health, and potentially reduce fuel poverty and associated health inequalities, I think it's really important that we emphasize that there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We really need to consider the housing stock heterogeneity, the fact that there is a lot of diversity when it comes to household needs, tenure types, attitudes, incentives, etc. So it's really a problem of socio-technical nature. Next slide, please. So what are the potential barriers and problems as we embark in those wide-ranging challenges? So I really think we need to avoid single-focused policies and strategies. And actions to mitigate climate change need to be carried out in tandem with actions to adapt our buildings to a much warmer climate. Because if we don't do this, we might end up with unintended consequences. So, for example, when we create those very thermally insulated, very airtight building envelopes, this might lead to the buildup of internally generated pollutants, or a trapping of heat in the summer, so an increase in overheating. And this will have adverse health effects and also lead to discomfort and potentially an increase in energy use due to increased cooling demand. The other major obstacle, in my opinion, is the unstable, if you'd like, evolving, very fluid policy landscape and the uncertainty in terms of potentially building regulations and funding mechanisms. So as a lot of you probably know, the Green Homes Grant, the government's flagship scheme for energy retrofit, was scrapped back in March. The recently released spending review has been criticised by many in the construction industry, that it hasn't been as ambitious in terms of launching a national housing retrofit strategy. So I think this is a major area where improvement is required. And there are, of course, other pressures, such as the drive to reduce construction costs and land and housing prices. But I think another important element is education, both in terms of upskilling the workforce, the architects and the builders, but also, I would not like to say training, but perhaps educating or preparing the people that are going to live in those new buildings, those rapidly changing environments, because in the past, our buildings would rely on those unintended air exchange paths for indoor air quality, for example. Following retrofit, we might find ourselves inhabiting buildings that rely a lot on mechanical ventilation systems or MVHR, if it's a passive house. So some of these systems might be relatively counterintuitive. So how do we prepare the occupants of these buildings for these new environments? Next slide, please. And we had, I mean, this brings me to my last slide about how to define innovation in the context of energy use in buildings. So we had some very interesting discussion as we were preparing for this webinar, and there was that definition of innovation as the useful application of creative ideas. And I'll just echo what Ian mentioned earlier during his introduction. Some might say that there is a lot of existing knowledge and robust evidence base in terms of what technologies and measures and policies might work to improve the energy efficiency of the housing stock. Others might say that there is a lot of new technological developments to be carried out and technological fixes. And I do think that the truth is somewhere in the middle. I do think that there is a strong knowledge base that we could use, lessons learned to be learned from vernacular architecture. I have an example there of external shutters somewhere in Italy, and I think it's an excellent example of this physical manifestation of climate responsive architecture. It's a construction element that can be adjusted to modify heat, light penetration. It can be angled to adjust airflow into the building or different privacy levels. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned, and more recently we've carried out a lot of work, me and colleagues in other research institutions, that demonstrate that, for example, external shutters do reduce overheating risk, and they also have other co-benefits. But where I do think that innovation is needed is at that interface, the human building interaction area. So how do we develop intuitive systems, easy to use controls that would allow occupants to interact with the building successfully and experience healthy, comfortable and low energy indoor environments. So I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. And yeah, I think some really important points there around some of those simpler technologies, but also how humans interact with the built environment. I think those are really important. To our audience, don't forget to get your questions into the chat, and we'll have a good discussion on those afterwards. But now I'll hand over to Angela, who can talk to us about some of the initiatives around sustainability in agriculture.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to join you in this fascinating discussion. I'm going to talk about food production because, of course, farmers are individuals whose business is to produce food. And I'm just going to talk you briefly through the main improvements and what we still need to do in this area. If I can move the slide on. So, okay. So in the UK, at least, farmers have been putting a huge amount of effort into reducing our global emissions already. So we're 10% versus 24% globally in terms of the amount of emissions coming from agriculture. But clearly there's a lot more to do if we want to reach net zero. And this is all being driven really by government policies and by action plans within the sector itself. And whilst I'm going to draw on UK examples, what I'm going to talk about is very much relevant all over the world. So what are the main areas where really we need to be acting even more in agriculture? Well, the first one is below our feet. And soils play a massive role in terms of climate change. But in agriculture, or land which is continuously under agriculture, focusing on soil organic carbon or carbon alone isn't really going to help us, because when land is continuously under cultivation, gains in soil organic carbon, although we can get them, they are small and rather slow. However, the really good news here, that even small increases in organic carbon improve soil health. And actually it's soil health that we need to be targeting, because that reduces inputs, increases resilience, improves water retention, for example. So it's soil health that we need to focus on, and that's what farmers are doing. We also need to maintain and restore those areas that are fantastic carbon stocks: forests, wetlands, peatlands, old grasslands. So, phasing away from using peat, for example, on gardens and allotments. And we also need to think about, if land is really not productive, can we not convert this into such a large carbon stock? But when you do that, you do need to be careful, because we could be displacing food production somewhere else. Now, when we are producing food off the land, it's about how do we continue to produce enough with less reliance on inputs. And over the past decade, agriculture has gone through a massive transformation through digitalisation. So the use of remote and proximal sensors, so things on the thing, but also satellites, for example, provide huge amounts of data on the health of the system, whether it's the environment, the crops, or the soils. Also, they're enabling us to apply our inputs in a much more precise way. So you only apply them when you need and in the amount you need in that place. We're reducing farm traffic and changing cultivation practices. So the bottom of the slide here shows direct drilling or methods of min-till, which have made minimum tillage, which have also improved soils. And last but not least, we have new methods of breeding, both crops and animals, which mean they are more resilient and produce less emissions and actually higher quality food. And all of that's important. Moving on to animals, there's a lot of talk about animals in respect to methane. And it's absolutely clear that we do need to all individually reduce our meat consumption. But there are also many things that are going on in the sector to reduce methane emissions from cattle. Feeding additives, for example. Sensors, again, I've already mentioned them, because the healthier the cow or the sheep, for example, the less they emit. Also, grass-fed beef is much better in terms of reducing emissions than grain-fed. And even when you're grazing, it's better to graze your animal in smaller fields and move them around, because that gives time for the grass and soil to recover. That's often called mob grazing or cell grazing, and it's very effective and very simple. But the other thing I want to mention in this slide is about being very careful how you compare different systems. And it's not just about cattle, but I'm using this example to show you. If you just take total amount of meat and look at emissions, beef is worse than chicken, as you can see here between the green and the orange histogram. If, however, you look at nutritional yield that's coming out of that meat, beef is actually better than chicken. It produces less emissions. And if you take everything into account, grass-fed versus and so on, beef is much better than chicken. So I think one has to be really careful in making comparisons about food production systems. And as an individual, when you make your choices, do make sure you look into exactly how those alternatives are produced. The other important thing is there's no single solution here. And I think that's true right across the sector. I think you've heard that from the other speakers. We need to combine and integrate. And one of the areas in agriculture that's happening is sometimes called regenerative agriculture, where you bring together a whole pile of different practices that overall reduce emissions. And again, they can be quite simple, but very effective to introduce. So keeping your soil covered, minimize soil disturbance, maximize the diversity of what you're growing, maintain a living root all the way in through the year, integrate livestock, and use more or longer rotations. And if you've got an allotment, all of those clues, maybe not the livestock, but nearly all of those clues will also help you on your allotment. But we also need to integrate in the system. And one way to do that is to combine energy and to combine production of energy to combine energy with food production. So perennial crops like trees, they're very good for the land. They're very good for the soil. We don't need many inputs to grow them. If you take the biomass from that and combust it, you're already doing a good thing. But if you then combine that with the physical process of fixing CO2 from that combustion into the ground, which is sometimes called BECCS or bioenergy and carbon storage, you end up with net zero. And that's where the industry is moving. It's a technology that we still need to prove in practice, but it's getting very close now. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, and we mentioned, the other speakers have mentioned this, what is innovation? Well, I think innovation is putting into practice useful improvements. And I've been trying to give you some examples of where we're heading in food production. We also need to accelerate this. We know the time now is to act. We need to move and think about how can we make sure that those useful innovations get out there in practice and are adopted. And with that, I finish with just one simple summary to show how reducing footprints, soils, resilience, cattle and greenhouse gases, energy and combined systems, and acceleration. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Angela. And again, you know, I think this is one that resonates with everybody. You know, food, water, and those things are right at the base of Maslow's pyramid of our needs. So none of us can escape the impact that our food has. So I think, yeah, lots of really, really useful information there. Thank you to our audience. We've started to get some questions coming in. So I will invite all of our speakers back, and we'll start to work through some of the audience questions. So the first one I have, I think is well suited to Mark, which is to make low carbon jet fuels, we will need renewable energy. But is there enough renewable energy to share out for everything that we need to do, so that we can also do all of the other things that we want and all of the other things that we're going to decarbonize through renewables?
Yeah, so put simply, at the moment, no. So that the process of producing synthetic jet fuels, as they're called, or electro e-fuels, via this process of generating hydrogen through electrolysis of water and then combining that with carbon dioxide is inefficient. It's about a 50% efficiency there or thereabouts at the moment. And I did some back of the envelope calculations, and these are just for the UK, but we'd need approximately, you know, another 30 power stations in order to generate the jet fuel required, or the jet fuel currently consumed in the UK. So it's a hugely challenging task to scale this up. I don't think we quite realize the scale at which we consume fossil fuels today. And I think that we can look to the COVID pandemic, and there's been some research in terms of how shutdowns affected emissions across the world, and the global emissions, CO2 emissions, reduced, relatively by a relatively small amount, of the order of 5% or so. Transport did reduce more significantly than that, but it's quickly rebounded, and it and it remains to be seen how that evolves. Obviously, we're traveling a little less into work, but there are growth areas across the world in terms of increasing mobility. So on the question of aviation, it's going to be challenging, but those drop-in fuels appear to be more desirable than, say, hydrogen, which has also been talked about, because that would require storage on the aircraft, and that storage often is associated with lots of heavy components that might require different aircraft architectures.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Mark. I think we've got a question next, which I think is one for Anna. But before I do that, I'm just going to say something that you touched on, and something that I know that we've chatted about in the past is human interaction with buildings. So I'm slightly amused by the fact that that over my my right shoulder you can see that there's an unnecessary light on in our active building, and this is a classic example. The reason for that is because in our high-tech building I can't find the switch to turn it off, and I've forgotten how to do it because I haven't been here over lockdown. So that is another example in practice of where we could have efficiencies and save a few watts and take the pressure off our system.
We have a similar problem in our building.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, my question to the question that's come into you, Anna, is as the UK has one of the worst efficiencies of housing in Europe, are there technologies that are used in other countries with similar climates to the UK that we could use or develop?
Yeah, so thanks for this question. I guess the obvious candidate would be the Passive House standard, which for the ones of you that don't know, relies on creating a very airtight, very insulated, very thermally efficient building fabric, and then ventilating right, as we say, build tight, ventilate right, and combined with mechanical ventilation and heat recovery. So there has been a lot of research done actually here at the Bartlett, at the Energy Institute, on how can we implement this at scale in the UK. And I think, again, a major barrier is workmanship, and having the skills in the workforce to achieve this very high airtightness levels for the building envelope. But also, as you say, is the interaction between occupants and that new paradigm of an indoor environment. I heard anecdotally that there was an old couple that were using the MVHR in winter mode during the summer, and their home ended up overheating, and that of course led to discomfort, and it was probably quite bad for their health. So yeah, there are different angles in this issue, but I guess that would be the first candidate that comes to mind in terms of technologies that could be applied.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I'm going to go back to Mark now, because I know Mark has sent his apologies as he has to leave. So we're going to squeeze in one more question for you, if that's okay, Mark. And then I know you've got to be in another meeting afterwards. So if I buy an EV when I have a functioning but fossil fuel burning car, there's an emissions cost for building the EV. So roughly how long does it take before the net emissions of the electric vehicle are less than continuing to drive the old car?
It's a great question. It comes down to several factors, but mainly driven by the electric car that you choose. So if you choose an electric car with a big battery, so equate that to a very long range, a large range, that would have much higher emissions associated with the production of that car. So producing big batteries means that that there's more embodied energy, more embodied carbon associated with that vehicle. So if you were to choose a big car, it's maybe going to be less efficient as well operationally relative to a smaller electric car. So you're going to have to drive that electric car more in order to offset relative to a diesel car, as it were. So if you're and if you're using a diesel car, but you're not using it very much, say you only do a few thousand miles a year, it might take you of the order of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years, if you're going for one of these bigger electric vehicles, to kind of reach the point at which that electric vehicle is beneficial. Now, there are other benefits associated with electric vehicles, like reduced emissions to the air. So that's important in our cities. More specifically, but I would encourage you to think about, do people need that range, the really big range of mileage? Can we still need to be focused on improving efficiency of transport, and there's a lot of wastage in how we use energy in transport. When we're thinking about private cars, we typically drive them on our own, or maybe with one other person, so occupancy is quite low. And we're essentially accelerating this huge mass of metal around and battery, when actually what we really want to do is just move the person around. So public transport is much better for energy consumption and CO2 emissions. I apologize for having to leave, but I really thank you for the invitation to join this event. And if anybody wants to send me any questions after the event, then I'd be happy to take them. And I thank Anna and Angela also for their contributions. I didn't realize that comparison with beef and chicken, Angela, so thanks for educating me.
No, thank you, Mark, for your contributions there. And I think some really, really important points there, which cover a lot of the conversation that we really want to have. Electric vehicles have a place, but they're not the magic bullet. And we have to think really carefully about what types of electric vehicles we use, when we use them, and ultimately, other modes of public and active transport playing a part. So thank you for some of those thought-provoking comments and for answering some of those questions for us.
No problem. I forgot to mention the second factor that's important is the carbon intensity of the electricity that's being used. So depending on the country and the carbon intensity of the electricity grid, that calculation is going to be affected by that. So apologies for skipping over that just then.
No worries. And I think those are key things as well. And I think that's another important point for us all to consider, is how things change as well, the dynamic system that we're in. So if you start to decarbonize the foundation industry and power generation, then actually some of these balances get tipped in different ways as well, which is important for us all to remember. So thank you very much, Mark. And now we've got a question for Angela, and I think we probably all have similar questions on our mind. I thought that was really wonderful about the comparison of beef and chicken, and again redresses some of those conversations. So the question is, how efficient can food production be in terms of CO2 emission, and how far do we need to cut back our consumption of, say, beef and chicken to match supply and demand for sustainable food production? So that's quite a meaty question, really.
It's a difficult question to answer, because as the previous in regards to the previous answer, there are so many externalities you have to bring into that to answer it, because it very much depends on the food production system in an area, and the reliance of people on specific types of foods in an area. And, so it's very hard for me to give an overall answer in terms of the amounts. But I can tell you that there is a big debate about whether net zero is really reachable in food production, because ultimately what we're trying to do is balance what you take off the land, because that's why we produce food, right? Whether it's an animal or a cattle, everybody relies on that being consumed. But it's a question of then what do we need to put into the land to get that off? And how do we balance that in a way that we're not losing anything in that system? And it's not just about some of the things I talked about. I think, Ian, you already mentioned huge amount of food is wasted. Some of it is wasted after harvest. Some of it is wasted during production. Some of it is wasted during processes. I don't know how many people realize, but when you get a lettuce, a lot of in the shops, a lot of the outer leaves have already been removed. And it's the same with the cabbages and other things to make it look nice. And there's a lot of things thrown away. And it's good to see that there are now things like wonky fruit, and wonky things in supermarkets, because a lot of food is wasted in the system. So I think we can really get these emissions down. It needs looking at what we do on the land and how we handle food, store it, distribute it, process it, distribute everything can be little increments along the way. Whether it will really get to net zero, I think, is something we would have to argue, because that's asking a lot in an energy, something that you're doing to get the energy into people. And what I tried to show with that histogram is it's very important to really look into how things are produced, just in the way that Mark has just said. It's all about the details. And sometimes you can make a judgment call and say, I'm not going to eat beef anymore. But actually, you might be consuming some things, which when you look into their production, it might be that they're worse. So that's what we need to get. We need to get kind of more into understanding the system itself.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that is such an important point. Is that detail, and you can make these, and this is what makes, I think, the whole field of climate action quite difficult for people to really get their head around. Is there's a lot of headlines out there, and there's a lot of detail underneath those things, and sometimes the two don't really match up. So yeah, really appreciate that. And as you say, that whole kind of water, energy, food nexus, people don't realize how much water and energy go into that, and the impacts of those things. So really interesting. I've got a question next for Anna, which is, so the UK has tried to stimulate retrofit twice with subsidies to homeowners, but without success. What are the reasons for the failure, and what is the pathway for mass building retrofitting that can be delivered in an affordable way for homeowners?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I mean, I think that the reason for the failures, at least for the Green Homes Grant recently, was the lack of accredited builders or retrofit providers. So I think that was seen as one of the reasons why. And as I said during my presentation, I think it's crucial that we provide stability. So there has been a lot of kind of kickstart action, but not a stable, kind of reliable funding mechanism over a number of years that has been carefully thought through. And in terms of how do we provide this mass housing retrofit program, there are different schools of thought. Some suggest that we should go for whole house retrofit, and I was involved in a research project years back that looked at how to develop different propositions for different household types, different tenure types, different housing typologies. As I said earlier, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And a lot of the advice is, okay, carry out these measures and your energy consumption will be reduced by that much. But often we don't take into account the disruption that this will cause to households. So how feasible it is for people's lives and lifestyles to be away from their home or live without disruption. And the other major issue is trust, having trust with the providers, and having follow-up advice, etc. So a lot of that research, even though we were approaching from a kind of building physics perspective, a lot of the discussion ended up being about how we develop those propositions for these different household types. And I think we also need to think very carefully who can afford those measures, who can afford to leave their homes while they're being retrofitted, and whether that's achievable for significant parts of the population, for lower income groups, etc. And there are other schools of thought that suggest that we adopt a more iterative approach, that we have whenever you carry out a small-scale refurbishment, like changing your kitchen or your bathroom, you might also want to be offering insulation through some funding mechanism. So yeah, there are different ideas out there. I'm not sure which one would be the most efficient one, probably a mix of all of them. But I think what's needed as a priority is appropriate policies and a national scale funding mechanism that takes into account kind of socioeconomic inequalities across the stock.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, lots of useful ideas there actually, and that's our sort of definition of innovation. So certainly some innovation to do around those things.
Yeah.
And I think actually a lot of those hit home, particularly that idea of if you're doing some refurb anyway, can you use that time and sort of increase the efficiency of your building. So that's fascinating. There's a question for Angela again, which is around the cost of food. So should we expect the cost of food to rise if we only buy food with a better climate performance, and taking all of the factors that you've mentioned into account?
Well, my question back is, do we value the cost of food enough? I mean, I think again, it's difficult to answer that question. I would argue that in the developed world, I said this actually when we were preparing, we had a discussion before, this actual webinar event. I think for those of us in a developed world, we've been living in an age of indulgence, really, to be honest. When you can go into the shop and if you need an item, it's in the shop, even if it's out of season. You can get it from anywhere in the world, and many of our stuff is all over the world, and you get pristine looking things. This is what we as consumers seem to have sort of driven, right? Of course, in other countries, they're struggling to get food, and half of their land is getting flooded, etc. So again, you can't answer it simply, but I would say this, do we value food enough? And it is linked with society for us. Our food budget is the smallest thing that we spend money on. It is often to do with rent and living, how we live. So our societies need to wake up to that fact that the cost of living for people squeezes what they can spend on food. And that surely isn't right. And it's not going to help us as we move towards the climate change issue, because people don't have that much left. A lot is committed to other expenditures. And so unless we solve that, I can't really answer your question. I think the value of food needs to be better than it is right now. To me, it's kind of nonsense that you can go in and buy one and get another one free. Someone's produced that off their land, and that's cost energy and it's cost emissions in the production. So but that's a societal issue in my view, and not one that I can just say, oh, well, it's going to increase and that's right, because there's much more in the balance than that.
No, I think that's an excellent point that again people need to really think about is where where food sits on our priority list. And we've got people in fuel poverty, but again it's this idea of the societal value of food and the fact that it has cost energy. It's been, and also getting it right reduces costs further down the line, such as health. So I'm going to take the liberty of answering a quick question. So there was a question around whether we can use methane as a and develop it as a fuel, capture it and develop it and use it as a fuel. And I think the answer that I would give on that is that yes, I mean certainly it's natural gas is effectively methane, so it can be used, but we get the same issue that we have around things like CO2. So carbon dioxide capture and utilization is also possible, and we can turn these things into all sorts of wonderful chemical feedstocks and fuels. But the problem is often the initial bit of finding a reliable source and how you go through the mechanism of capture. That can be really, really tough. And I think that's probably where the challenge sits, because it's a similar situation that we saw recently, you know, when natural gas supplies dropped and we had a CO2 shortage, which seems odd to many people in the public when they realize how much we're emitting. So the question you always get then is, well, can't we just use the emitted CO2? And the answer to that is yes, but not yet. So I guess that's one of those examples where the innovations exist but are being worked upon.
Sorry, Ian, could I just answer that or add to that? Because in agriculture, there are a number of innovations which are capturing methane as biogas and using that on farms. So, for example, one of the things that we're supporting in the Shake is a small scale production where manure goes in from the farmer. They produce, gas from that, which is used to actually power some of what he's doing on the farm, but they also produce a byproduct, which is a fertilizer. So I agree with you, Ian, it's doable. The issue is about scale, and it's rolling it out really on different scales that really work for people in the scales that they need them to, as well as on a national scale.
Brilliant, thank you. So we're getting close to the end. So I think really now it's just about enough time for me to thank our speakers. So huge thanks to Mark, Anna, and Angela. Really appreciate the insights there. Also, thanks to the team behind the scenes. So Ria, Rosa, who've been keeping us on track, and Richard there, all from the Centre of Climate Change Innovation, who've Richard came up with the concept for this. So we really appreciate the insights from the speakers, and we thank our audience as well for listening, and really I hope that when you look at these key points, there was a lot of similarities, even though the sectors are very different. Lots of things about thinking about how we can become more efficient by reducing waste, but also to understand the detail underneath the headlines. I think if that's something that you take away from today, I think that's really useful, and a place where we can all increase our own understandings of the systems that we interact within, and make our own progress towards net zero. So that just brings me to remind everyone watching at home that we will be posting the recording of this, so you will get access to that. Thank you all for your excellent questions and for your attention. Apologies if we didn't manage to get to yours, but keep an eye out on the Grantham Institute's YouTube channel, so that you can watch again or share with friends and colleagues whenever you want. Otherwise, that's it from me. So have a great day, everyone, and thanks again to our speakers for the contributions, and to our audience for your questions.
Thank you from us. Yes.